In the Christian church calendar today, it's Transfiguration Sunday. It's the Sunday when many churches remember the day on which Jesus went up on a mountaintop with 3 of his disciples that became transfigured or transformed into a brilliant light. But today I've chosen a different story that shows a different kind of transfiguration or transformation. Characters in this story aren't changed in their actual appearance, but their lives are transfigured or transformed by Jesus' presence. And his words shine a light into their hearts. Jesus shines that same light into our hearts if we allow him, and invites us also to be transfigured or transformed by him. The story that we've heard today is a kind of tale of 2 cities story, only it's a tale of 2 hearts. And it's just as full of surprises and unexpected reversals as Dickens' novel. That classic novel begins with the line, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And this story is also about the best of times for someone who was not expecting it, and the worst of times for someone who was caught off guard. Dickens takes 45 chapters to tell his story. Thank goodness Luke tells just as powerful a story in only 15 verses. I've chosen this story this morning because it captures the heart of the good news of Jesus in this single scene around a table, which is where our service is leading this morning. It's leading us to a table where each of us have been invited to join Jesus. Which leads me to wonder, why did Simon the Pharisee, this is not Simon Peter the disciple, there must have been a lot of people named Simon. Anyway, Simon the Pharisee, why did he invite Jesus over to his house? What was he hoping to get out of it? It was not uncommon in Jesus' time for the religious and community leaders to host debates or discussions in their homes around the important topics of the day or around big theological and religious questions. The news about Jesus had been getting around. His ability to heal people, crowds of people, and his surprising teachings. Shortly before Simon's invitation to Jesus here in Luke 7, Jesus has saved the life of an army officer's servant by healing him long distance. He wasn't even there with the man. Following that, Jesus has restored life to a dead man during the man's funeral procession as he was being carried out of town to the burial ground. Luke tells us that after Jesus did that, everyone was filled with awe and spread around this message. A great prophet has appeared among us. God has come to help his people. They would whisper and proclaim to one another. And so it's no wonder that Simon was at the least curious, maybe even eager to check out this news for himself and to judge for himself if it was true. And we see that that's exactly what's on his mind, because he responds to he is evaluating Jesus' response to the woman by saying, if this man were a prophet. So we can see that he's evaluating who Jesus is in the light of what's going on. Simon is trying to answer that question for himself. Who is Jesus? And at the end of the story, we hear that other guests are also asking, who is this that forgives sins? If you ever wonder, who is Jesus? This is a story that might lead you to the answer. As Luke tells this story, those of us who are listening are quickly aware that at the very least, Jesus is a prophet, for he can read Simon's thoughts, and he's completely aware of who the woman is, along with what her reputation is. Unbeknownst to Simon and his guests. But Luke has told us this in chapter 2, so as readers of this story, we know this. About 30 years earlier, a very old, devout man named Simeon had taken the baby Jesus in his arms in the temple and had prophesied over him, saying, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many, for the hearts of many will be revealed." Jesus would reveal people's hearts. He would know our inmost thoughts. In this story, Jesus reveals two hearts. First, there's the heart of this woman who causes such a shocking disturbance at Simon's house. She crashes the party, disrupts the meal with her crying and wailing. She touches Jesus with shocking intimacy. What's going on that she would make such a spectacle of herself? It's unlikely that she and Jesus are meeting for the first time there at Simon's house. It's much more likely that there's some kind of a backstory that Luke hasn't told us. Perhaps that she's heard Jesus preaching, maybe even that sermon on the plain that we've been looking at for the last 2 Sundays. The sermon where Jesus begins by reassuring those who are hated and hungry and sad that they will be blessed. And then he warns those who think they've got it made that that's all they'll get. Perhaps these words caught her attention because she had lost hope for ever receiving any kind of blessing. She lost hope for ever having any kind of healthy relationships in her life with her family or her community. She'd lost hope for ever having a relationship with God. She had been told that she was doomed in God's eyes because of the things that she had done, because of the miserable person that she was. I mean, her reputation was all over town. Simon knew it. Simon knows she's a sinner, he was thinking. One of my New Testament professors in seminary pointed out that it's been commonly assumed that this woman is a prostitute, as if the only sin a Jewish woman of the first century could commit was a sexual sin. But in writing the story, Luke chooses not to name her specific sin, and my guess is that there were as many ways to sin back then as there are for us today. We should not narrow the scope of her sin to one particular fault. In the Jewish context, a sinner was anyone who was not faithfully following God's law. The woman had made some significant mistake or committed some crime, and everyone knew about it, and everyone talked about it, and they shunned her as a result. After she heard Jesus preaching hope for people like her, she must have heard him then speak about putting mercy into action. And clearly she didn't just hear him talk about it, but went on to actually experience Jesus putting mercy into action. For unlike Simon, who was concerned about tarnishing his reputation by being seen with sinners, Jesus was getting the reputation of being a friend of sinners. That's in the verse just before our reading today. We aren't told about the extent of Jesus' friendship with this woman, but it was enough that he had offered forgiveness to her for her sin, had set her free from the terrible load of shame and guilt, of failure and worthlessness that she had been carrying. The weight of her past was lifted. Her mistakes no longer defined her. She was free to draw near to people again, to draw near to Jesus, to draw near to God. She was free to move about in the community as a new creation, a new life. And what Jesus reveals of her heart is that such a great weight was lifted, such a great debt was cleared, that her heart is overwhelmed with gratitude. She's crying with relief. She, after feeling worthless for so long, she feels loved again and lovable. She doesn't care what others think about her anymore. She only cares about what Jesus thinks. And he reassures her again, your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Jesus exposes another heart at that dinner table. Simon, Jesus asks, who is more grateful? A person with one maxed out credit card debt forgiven, or a person with 10 maxed out credit cards forgiven and written off? And Simon's no dummy, he knows his math, and he gives the obvious answer. The one forgiven 10 times the amount, of course. Jesus tells him that this is the principle that explains the woman's audacious behavior. But Jesus doesn't just stop there. He goes on to compare the woman's extravagant hospitality with Simon's neglect of even the basic considerations a host should offer a guest. Simon's heart is exposed, and what is revealed is that he has been so busy judging Jesus, judging the woman, that he's not even taken a moment to reflect on his own behavior. What is revealed is his sense of pride and privilege, such that he might deny that he had any faults at all that needed to be forgiven. Simon's heart is filled with a self-righteousness that prevents him from recognizing his need for Jesus' righteousness. Without that sense of need, there's no reason for gratitude. There's no reason for love. Luke doesn't tell us how Simon reacts to Jesus' remarks, to having his heart exposed to everyone at the dinner party. I wonder if he reacts defensively, if he defends his lack of hospitality, maybe blames someone else in his household for neglecting to provide that wash basin for Jesus. I wonder if he gives some smart comeback about how he didn't have any debts and didn't owe anything to anyone. Maybe he justified himself, explaining how he prays at every meal and keeps all the 10 Commandments, and he's gone to church since he was a kid. It's no wonder Jesus was killed. Forgiveness is a powerful thing, leading hearts to either rejoice or resent. Because offering forgiveness to someone implies that they need it. Jesus doesn't condemn Simon for his hard-heartedness. He simply points it out, offering the observations. Those who have been forgiven little, love little. Let me ask you a question now. What have your thoughts been about Simon the Pharisee as you heard this story being read and as I've talked to him? Did you pick him out as the bad guy in the story? Did you figure out that he was judgmental and unloving and full of himself? It's so natural for us to fall in the same trap, and bam, before we know it, we're the ones judging Simon. We're criticizing the splinter in his eye rather than looking for the plank in our own. Are we any less judgmental than he was for those who have made mistakes, who have bad reputations, who've made poor choices? Are we too confident in our own good behavior, in our own striving to follow God? Take your eyes off those around you and allow Jesus to shine a light on your heart. Allow him to reveal to you your heart. What do you see? This is an outrageous story that contains the whole outrageous message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That God had such love for us, such compassion for us in our weakness, that he sent his one and only Son to offer us forgiveness, to write off our heavy debt that we owe, so we can live life free from that burden, free from the fear of failing, free to love with our whole hearts. The story of Jesus disrupts our lives and exposes our secrets, sometimes calling us to account, and sometimes calling us to rejoice, always inviting us to love. In the final scene of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities, one man is condemned to death for a crime. But at the last moment, another man slips into the prison to take his place at the guillotine. Jesus takes our place, takes the consequences for our failures, our brokenness, our selfishness, our shortcomings, and our shame. True faith, my friends, is that person who knows, knowing their heart, and has an encounter with Jesus in which they discover God's forgiveness. And the sign and the proof of that faith is gratitude and love. We're going to stand and sing, My Jesus, I Love Thee. It's number 101.